demographics of a society or fuels the emergence of social groups. However, as I will emphasize repeatedly in this book, not all forms of conflict are violent. Think of the way that, for good or ill, legislative jostling or conflict reshapes the policies that govern people's lives and prompts the formation of organizations for advocacy or resistance. Think of the way that nonviolent social movements and actions, such as the 2017 Women's March on Washington, or civil rights sit-ins, protests, and marches past and present, have used conflict to expose injustice, motivate negotiation, and force change. Every day, in small ways, conflict shapes human community. It affects the dynamics of friend groups, families, classrooms, work environments, and congregations. Conflict is a catalyst for change, and if approached constructively, it can be a catalyst for positive change. This view of conflict reflects the latest in a lineage of approaches: conflict prevention, management, resolution, and now transformation. Rather than beginning with the assumption that conflict can be prevented, this approach understands conflict to be a normal and unavoidable part of life. Rather than perceiving conflict as something to be managed and contained, conflict transformation intends to work constructively with conflict as a catalyst for change. Rather than focusing only on a problem to be solved, this approach also tries to engage conflict in a way that begins something new and good. In everyday speech, we apply the term conflict to everything from interpersonal tension to international war. So it's crucial to understand that the literature and the practitioners of conflict transformation are not claiming that everything we associate with conflict is natural and necessary. Rather, they are calling for a more precise understanding of the term. They sharpen our focus to the place and moment in which perceptions, needs, desires, ideas, or convictions strike together. Striking together is a part of living in an ecosystem that is changing and interrelated. Conflict is natural and necessary. How we respond to these moments and circumstances of conflict warrants moral assessment and action. In other words, though we cannot choose whether to be in conflict, we can choose how to respond to it. Violence is one response to conflict, but violence and conflict are not the same thing. To be accurate here, I need to distinguish firmly between the two and then blur the distinction a bit. We experience violent conflict, a physical fight, for example, and nonviolent conflict, a verbal disagreement, and we respond to conflict with violence, a retaliatory strike, or nonviolence, a sit-in. When we conflate conflict and violence, we lose sight of a vast range of human interaction and the possibilities that reside in them. This distinction between violence and conflict is crucial, because one can only respond to conflict non-violently and use conflict non-violently for purposes of social change. If we lose the distinction between violence and conflict, we obscure the rich tradition and ongoing efforts of nonviolent resistors to engage conflict constructively for purposes of social change. Nonviolent resistance is also one response to conflict, one approach to or use of conflict. Moreover, nonviolence shares the umbrella of conflict transformation with practices of meditation, restorative justice, and circle facilitation, because all of these actions rest on the assertion that conflict can be a catalyst for constructive change in relationships and communities. However, it's also important and honest to complicate these distinctions a bit. The lines between violent and nonviolent resistance are blurry because there are so many different kinds of violence. Violence is both overt and hidden. It is physical, structural, and psychological. It is already experienced and persistently threatened. Regimes and persons alike can behave violently in any number of ways without manifesting physical harm. Nonviolent resistors also blur the distinction between violence and nonviolence when they advocate sanctions that restrict access to basic goods.